This is as good a time as any to finish the thought. I was wondering to myself, if time is made up of two forces, each one are monopolar vectors with a north and a south pole to them, I began to wonder, what does that mean? Well, how does that relate to the absolute and versus the relative? And so the only thing I could imagine was, oh, well, that's easy. In fact, that's the foundation upon which how to define what do the forces have to do with the absolute versus the relative. And so when I look at it, what I see is, I've already mentioned to you that there are two bidirectional forces that tug on the opposite side of the fence, so to speak. In other words, nothing is done by force to push you. We call it a force, but we should really use the physicist term of charm, because it's really the nature of charm that draws us towards something. It's not that we get pushed because something else is horrible behind us. We like to say that in this world filled with negativity and stress, we like to presume that, oh, I didn't get off my butt until something really terrible happened. Well, something terrible happened to put in perspective a goal or a target that never seemed that attractive up until then, and all of a sudden it became very attractive by contrast. So actually what we do is we live by contrast, and this is a world filled with contrasts, and we have to get used to it. And it's all kinds of contrasts, absolute and the relative, biggest contrast of all. But the motive force for a vector is charm, because there's only two choices to think about, right? You push or pull. So which is it? Is the vector being pushed from its origin? Well, how can it be? The origin is a point. So all the force is ahead of that point, pulling it. There's no such thing as push. What? But I thought high voltage driving current to low voltage is a push. Is it? Are you sure? You may want to double check. Get to that in maybe another episode. And it works with what I know to be true already. See, I'm piecing this together in pieces as I grow, a little piecemeal by piecemeal. So I already know that Dharma is the gap between the absolute and the relative, and it's a tug that wants to pull what's on the opposite side towards itself, which means that the target is the point, the arrow point of a vector, and what's being tugged is the starting point. And so vectors don't push, they pull. And so that means, you see, I said this in another video that I didn't post because I just didn't feel like posting it, so it's worth saying it now that I figured this thing out in stages. Time is not forwards versus backwards. There's no such thing. We take forward time to be the norm only because we take entropy to be the norm. We see everything running down, including ourselves. At the end of the day, we got to go to sleep. Yet, as Charlie Lutz would put it so aptly, when we meditate, we reverse our direction on the wheel of rebirth, the wheel of necessity, the wheel of the cycles of nature, because everything nature does is entropic. It moves forward. But there is something else that happens in which you can slip past Mother Nature. And it happens in the gap between any two states of consciousness. It's part of our evolution to go to sleep, to wake up, to fall into the dream state, to fall into the deep dreamless state of deep sleep. And whenever we move from one of those three states of consciousness to another one of those three states of consciousness, there's a gap between the two, and in that gap there's always the opportunity, but never the guarantee, that we will transcend and experience samadhi, the fourth state of consciousness. So in my perception of the chakras, each petal at least when we're talking about Sanskrit on this planet Earth, because on other planets it's can be organized a little differently depending on what their aesthetic theme is, but be that as it may. On a planet in which the golden ratio is the norm of the aesthetic theme, we know this because humpback whales sing in a diatonic scale, and if you speed up a recording of humpback whales, it's the same as a mockingbird. The melodic pattern, the pitch, and the speed, when you get the three to match, well, when you get it to match the speed or the pitch, when you get it to match the pitch range of a mockingbird, then the melodic pattern and the speed correspond. It's like somebody sped up a recording because that's exactly the way it sounds. Anywho, it's diatonic, which means it's based on the golden ratio. Well, on this planet of that aesthetic theme, which is foreign to this solar system, okay, get a little heads up there. This planet is an import from another place, but that's a whole other story in itself. But on a planet in which the golden ratio is the norm, the Sanskrit is so structured that the first chakra has 4 petals to it. That means 4 functions, and they operate as an organic unit. And there's always an extra petal which represents, to any system there's always an extra component which represents the transcendental state of that system. Because every system has to have a transcendental state. It has to be able to operate in the transcendent, which means just be, without activity. Yet it still exists, just there's no activity. It's not mindless, it's not the void, because it doesn't have any quality to it, so we can't call it what Nietzsche and other existentialists called it. We can't call it the void. So we just say it's transcendental because it transcends any qualification, any quality. Well, in that state, it's coming out that we get all the energy from that deep rest. But it's all those 4 functions of those 4 states of consciousness are cyclic. They keep cycling. One replaces the other. How much time we spend in each is another story. We don't spend a whole lot of time in the transcendental state, then we don't grow vertically. We grow horizontally. We grow in our ability to do all kinds of things, but we don't grow out of the need to be reborn, or the desire for that matter, the tug, the charm. We grow out of the charm of being reborn. You know, what does Mother Nature give us? She gives us, at the end of our life, when we die, she gives us our last thought, and she fulfills it in our next incarnation. She has to. But because she always tries to give us both sides of every view, she puts a little spin on it. We always overlook. If our vision was cosmic, we wouldn't have any outstanding desires, and we wouldn't die, causing us to die. I mean, we wouldn't have any outstanding desires to cause us to die, to cause us to want to be reborn, because it's inherent in the subconscious that if we have any unfulfilled desire, it will be fulfilled in our next rebirth. And it's automatic, but it'll have a spin put on it so that we don't become obsessive about this automatic success. Now that we have it, we want it, we had to die to earn it, and instead of sitting pretty, a little spin is put on, a little spit. Nature spits on it a little, so that we go, oh, I don't think I like that idea anymore. So we grow. We're forced to grow ever so slowly, but eventually we grow up ever so slowly, just by the cycles of nature. Even if we don't meditate, or if we don't take on the responsibility of other people's lives, which is a path of karma. The path of karma can also be a path of yoga to accelerate our evolution. It gives us so much added weight to our karma that we grow really fast. Because when we blow it in a big way, not in a small way, because now we're managing other people's affairs. So it really, if you want to speed up your growth and you don't have access to yoga, you can always take on your shoulders the responsibility for other people, their lives. Anyway, so the 4 states of consciousness cycle. They're all cyclic because they cannot be maintained. No sooner than you go into the transcendent, you're popped right back out again. And how long you stay in is probably a question of the technique involved. How involved was the technique? How much of your physiology did it take to transcend? And techniques vary. The harder ones involve more of you, and so you end up staying in longer as a matter of course, but they're much more involved. Oh boy. But the easier ones, you may pop right out, back out again. There's no guarantee you'll be in very long. That depends on how familiar you become with that state and how much your other karma allows you to stay there. That too. Because you may have karma that draws you back out. Say, hey, you've stayed in there long enough, come out here and refresh us. Because nature wants the benefit. So she'll draw you out when she decides to get the benefit of your mini enlightenment so that you can spread it around and fertilize her creation. Very innocently, without you trying to do anything. It just happens automatically. It's so automatic. The process of evolution, it's so automatic. We make an effort to accelerate, then we bumble along and create pain for ourselves, but we do accelerate if we're sincere. That's what we want. But we also make a lot more mistakes. But we don't have to. It's just so automatic. So the cycles of nature, the four petals in the Muladhara chakra at the base of the spine, they're deep sleep, dream, the waking state, and samadhi. Now, there's a fifth petal, though, and that is their integration, which of course is cosmic consciousness. But it lies outside the base chakra. And the base chakra, the only thing it's interested in is survival. And so you don't have to be interested in survival, obviously, if you're not going to die upon the death of your body, if your awareness continues to remain awake. And you're no longer attached to your karma, and so you don't get judged. Because there's nothing to judge. You don't have any karma to judge. You're vibrating outside the range of karma, and you don't have a body for the karma to be attracted to you either. So the last vestigial remainder of your karma is the fact that your body was still alive. Anywho, why did I get off on this track? There was a reason. So any system, so when you look at the Muladhara, you're looking at a division of four functions, and they are siddhi powers. And there's a lot of siddhi powers in the crown chakra, but among the six major chakras beneath the crown chakra, there are functions to each chakra, sub-functions to each chakra that are organic. They're hardwired into the nervous system on this planet the way they are, and the ones that are socially acceptable are the ones that everybody can agree on. Oh yeah, we've opened up the same chakras, which for most of humanity is the first chakra and the second chakra. 4 functions of the first chakra and 6 of the second. So that's about 10 functions that we can all agree on that are commonplace. And anything out of that, you're given a psychiatric diagnosis or worse, a disease. Something like there's something wrong with you, But because people don't understand. You can't understand anything greater than yourself. You can only understand what is the same as yourself or beneath you. But if it's too beneath you, you can forget what it's like and be a little confused. What is that? Until you're given a slap in the face. And I was given that last night in a dream, and I had to take certain actions today to remedy the situation because I had no idea what I had been getting myself into. But it made sense once I saw the dream. I said, oh, okay, whoops. I'm a little dim, but one way or another, awareness reaches me, and then I go, oh yeah, okay. Hey, I'm naive. I'm only dim because I'm naive. I live in a very narrow bubble world of my own making, for the most part. Anyway, so the extra function to every set of function is the transcendental function. So in order to analyze anything, we always need that extra function. We want to be holistic. We look at all of the organic parts that work together to create the whole of that system that works together to create a certain result, and we can analyze each part and we can focus on each part, and that's what the chakras do. They allow us components to each of their chakras. They're called petals, and their functions are called siddhis, or characters if you prefer, characteristic aspects of our personality. Virtues, if you prefer. You have to have, for every siddhi power, there is a corresponding virtue that goes with it, so that when you exercise the siddhi, you are practicing a virtue. The ability to understand something, anything that gets put in front of your face, is the ability to be honest. The ability to be so open that you are entirely open to the universe, and by reciprocation, the universe has to be totally open with you. And that means anything that comes before your face is an open book. It's not a mystery. It might be a mystery for a little while, if it's technical, a little longer, but eventually you keep putting your attention on it, you figure it out. Just by putting your attention on it. You figure it out because of that reciprocity of exercising that virtue through the vehicle of that functionality of that siddhi power, that yogic power. Okay? So, as Patanjali says, we can be born with them. You don't have to do anything. You can acquire them by herbs, by mantras, all kinds of different ways of acquiring powers. Usually, hopefully, it's better to acquire them as a side effect and not as a, unless there's certain things like I got to keep my body alive. I wasn't born with a great deal of health, so I have to work at it constantly because I'm congenitally defective. And now I'm finding out I have a genetic disorder, and it has nothing to do with mental illness. It all has to do with the body, although it ends up in the mind, but the cause is in the body. So now I know these things, and there are natural alternative remedies for just about everything on this planet except that which is unforgivable, and we don't have to go there. But diabetes, liver ailments, there are all these techniques, supplements, protocols that can address them, so you don't have to go to drugs or alcohol, as some people go to, or hitting yourself over the head. You don't have to do that either. So when we look at electrodynamic theory, we always have to include the transcendental aspect of the relative in order to properly analyze the situation. This is just a byproduct of my study of the chakras that came out of fasting on fruits and vegetables for 2 years as a teenager. I got to study the functionality of the chakras because they were right in my face. I could see them, using subtle vision, because I already could see auras when I was a kid anyway. I can't now, but I've lost a lot of things, seemingly overwhelmed by the stress of the aging process. But the fast enhanced it, and the fact that I was meditating, the two together. And I made a study of it, and I could see various aspects to it that I never saw before because I never had my attention on it. My passion was my focus, the excitement of life. And here I was fasting, and so I got to settle down and look at things that I could not have looked at otherwise had I not settled down during the course of that 2 years. And in the course of that, then I realized the functionality of the ajna chakra, that are just two, and it has to do with karma. We create karma, and we eat our karma that we create. And that's the functionality of the ajna chakra. Now we can eat other karma, if we choose to, that we didn't create, but be that as it may, we either emit karma or we absorb it. The expression, I'll eat my hat if I'm wrong. Well, we have to eat our hat, we have to eat our karma to make room so that we can manifest more karma, because if there's too much karma attached to ourselves out here in the relative, or inside the body attached to us, then there's congestion, and then we can't manifest. So you wonder, how does that angel manifest a flower if they're in charge of manifesting flowers? A little devata in charge of a pushpam, a flower, and manifest the flower. How do they do? Well, because they don't have any karma to get in the way. So the flip side of creating karma is the absorption of it, so that you can make room to create better karma than what you ate. Create a better world. Bucky Fuller talked about that all the time. That's our responsibility as humans, is design a better world. So that's the functionality of the ajna chakra, and then the in-between I don't care, but because those are the two I function between, the top, the high and the low, and everything in between. But there's always a transcendental aspect behind each and every one of those groups of functionalities, and it's no different with electrodynamics. So when we interpret the pair of forces at the basis of electrodynamics, we have to look at them in terms of the absolute. What relationship do they have to the absolute? Well, but when we look at them as complementary opposites, there's also the relative to look at. So now we got two things. We have to include the relative along with the absolute when looking at Dharma, because electricity lives in the gap between the absolute and the relative. It's the simplest state of consciousness, of awareness, of life, because it literally sits at the gap and can negotiate between the two worlds, the relative and the absolute. It's so beautiful a study, because it gets to the heart of science, because it's literally the bridge between God and man. Whoops! Wow! So, but what does it have to do? Well, because the vector will either be rooted in the absolute, headed towards the relative, or it'll be rooted in the relative, headed towards the absolute. And it's heading towards its target based on the charm of that target, not based on anything spurring it from behind, because it's got an endpoint behind it. There's no, how can I put this? There's no force behind you if behind you is the point that started the vector. You have to have a legacy. And if you go back and find a boundary to your legacy, then where's the prior step, I was doing a mix of words there, previous and prior makes prior. Where's the prior status before the point? There is none. So all of the force of motivation for you to move is ahead. And so it has to be charming, or else it wouldn't draw you towards it. But you have always two choices. You can go towards the relative from the absolute, or you can go towards the absolute from the relative. We come out of meditation, that's what we do. We're drawn out of it by Mother Nature. She wants our bliss. And when we are drawn to meditate to increase the likelihood that we will transcend, it's because we're tired of the relative. It's not enough. It's not good enough anymore. The cycles of nature are not good enough. We're tired of the repetition. Even though there's endless variety to that repetition, we're tired of the repetition alone, and we're starting to question, is this all there is to life? I'm born, I die, is that it? Come on, there must be something more to life, to the purpose of life, than just the cycles of nature. Yeah, it's transcending. So that's when we want to transcend, and that's when we want that charm to draw us towards the transcendent by that choice that we make. We make that choice. Until we make it, we'll probably be put into weird situations wondering why, and it's really the weird situations are just to create the contrast necessary for us to want to make that choice, because it's totally based on our choice. Mother Nature can't force us to do anything, and I know that from experience, from my own perception, of my own experience. When you get to even God consciousness, more elevated than cosmic consciousness, you still cannot stabilize it unless you want it to be stabilized. And I've been putting off stabilization for decades because I don't want it. I just keep popping in and popping out, popping in and popping out. And one of these days I'll stop resisting, or I'll die and have to pick up where I left off in the next lifetime. But eventually I'll stop resisting and decide that I want it enough to stop sabotaging it, because I have to do something to sabotage it, because I was following a natural urge to go in that direction. Why? Because it gives me more bliss, it gives me more energy, it gives me more intelligence to proceed onwards to greater and greater enlightenment. And yet I don't want to go all the way, so I sabotage it. But I have to do something, and it's usually something painful and hurtful to myself in order to sabotage it, because it's contrary to the flow that I'm naturally proceeding along at that time. It's contrary. So it's going to have to be painful. There's no other way. And it's self-hurtful. In a small way, like a drop of blood, in a small way. But it's still obvious. Oh yeah, there it is. I know. I know how things work. I'm not stating anything new to myself. But in order to look at this charm nature to a vector, we still have to incorporate the transcendental state of the absolute, state of non-change, the field of non-change, or the status of non-change, in contradistinction to the field of change, which is what we know, what our senses tell us. in order to properly understand electrodynamic theory, let alone appreciate the gap between those two extremes wherein electrodynamics operates. Now, it's not to say it doesn't have tentacles reaching out to both sides, but it's at the gap that the vista or the vantage point is, or the window of view, to which is ascribed the dynamics of electricity, is in the gap. So, the point of this video was, what's the nature of a vector, and extending the idea that the absolute is involved. You cannot leave it out of the equation because it's in contrast to the relative. Well, it's not usually the way scriptures talk about, why was creation manifested? Was because God was bored, And it sounds silly, but it's true. It sounds silly, but it's true. When you're in bliss long enough, you want a little excitement. So you manifest a creation. And on occasion, step into it. Your own creation. Anywho. I think I've said everything. Okay. So, nighty-night. See, we don't have to rat on anybody. We don't have to harp on any negativity in order to discuss a topic. And I guess last night I was stressed. And so, I had to wash my car. That's right. I didn't want to have to wash it. But wash it I did. And I had a little leftover remainder of stress I didn't want to admit to myself. So there it is. I got over the stress and cleared my vision. And so now I can finish the topic with clarity. Because I questioned whether or not time has two directions to it. Because I know that entropy only has one direction. Well, in order to meditate, the mind, as Charlie Lutz would say so many times, the mind has to turn 180 degrees around in order to transcend. 179 and it will not transcend. It cannot come close, but it won't. You have to turn the mind around diametrically opposite to the direction we are pointed in when we're out here in activity in order to transcend. You may, 179 degrees, you may settle down to a nice quiet state, but you won't transcend. You'll simply be at a nice quiet state, maybe even deeper than deep sleep, but still within the field of the relative. So that means there really are two directions. And they are vectorial because each one is a force. The nature of a force is, it stands on its own. It doesn't need support from anything except to describe it. The context. All it needs is a context, but it doesn't need time. And that's the difference between a force and electricity. An ingredient, a forceful ingredient of electricity and electricity itself is that electricity always has to be measured in terms of time to have any meaning, which means we've already divided it down into one of its forces. We recognize that time is a component of electricity, so it cannot be non-divisible or atomic, and it cannot be conserved, because only non-divisibles can be conserved. Anything which is divisible has to be destroyable into its constituent parts. So how can energy, electrical energy at the very least, as an example, be conserved? It's impossible. It's a contradiction of terms. And this is what blows me away. It took this much training on a simulator to bring this to my awareness that it's simply a contradiction of terms to say that the conservation of energy is a contradiction of terms. Because energy is not atomic. We can break it down into its constituent ingredients. And it had to be Eric Dollard, too. In addition, between the two, the simulator and Eric Dollard, between those two factors, I never would have been able to figure this out on my own at all. But Eric Dollard points the way because he gives us a template which can be applied to matter. Hey, he's talking about electrical energy. If Einstein had any validity when he said E equals mc squared, then we should be able to take the conservation of energy and apply it to matter. We should be able to take the synthesis and decomposition of electricity according to Eric Dollard and apply it to matter. Even though he doesn't like physicists, and even though he doesn't like Einstein, we still should be able to, and we can, and I just did. It's called a new atomic model, in which we recognize that Democritus, we inherited this notion of the atom from Democritus, who formulated it originally as meaning non-divisible. It's the smallest unit of matter. You cannot divide any further. And now it doesn't mean that anymore. Which is just like us in the English-speaking world. We keep changing the meanings of words, and we don't notify ourselves. We just keep going on as if nothing happened, or we change the meaning to its complete opposite. You know, the Bible talks about contemplation. They're talking about meditation. They talk about prayer. They're talking about contemplation. You know, everything got backwards. But I found that out from a bunch of monks visiting Maharishi International University, and were interviewed, and I saw the video. I didn't see them. They came like a year or two prior to my visit there, and they were visiting from a monastery at upstate Iowa, and they said, we got it totally backwards when we translate the Bible, because we don't even understand the use of their words. It's totally backwards. And this is what Charlie Lutz would always say many, many times. The materialist looks at the spiritual and gets it backwards every time. And when somebody came up to Charlie and asked, Charlie, I don't understand what you just said. And no sooner than the words came out of that person's mouth that somebody else came up to Charlie. Oh, excuse me, Charlie, is this what you meant when you said? And he got it completely backwards, and it was obvious. It was something else, and it was obvious to the guy asking the question. So, oh, well, that answers my question. Charlie didn't even have to answer. Somebody else answered for me. Well, it's the way it was with the Bible, with those terms, you know, contemplation, prayer, and meditation. We got them backwards. Now, why did I get off on that? Okay. Well, because of several things. Charm. Forces are motivated by charm. They're not motivated by aggression or pressure coming from behind. So I'm going to have to rethink this ideology that we have, that current is being pushed by voltage instead of drawn by a vacuum ahead of it. You know, less resistance. Hello, it wants to go we know it wants to take the path of least resistance, so why shouldn't it want to go somewhere? Because we don't recognize that electricity is the manifestation of the simplest state of consciousness, of life. There you go. We don't want to say, we say a circuit is alive or it's dead, but we don't want to ascribe to it consciousness. We just say, oh, I was just saying it's on or it's off. I don't really mean it's alive. You know, like I'm alive. Oh, really? Are you sure? You see, we're hypocrites. We're not integrated. We're not holistic in our view. It's amazing. I won't dwell on that. Hey, if we use the English language, then say what you mean and mean what you say, or else Lewis Carroll was right. We're a bunch of fluies. We don't say what we mean because we don't mean what we say. Oh, it's getting hot in here. Okay. So time really does have two directions to it, but it's not forwards and it's not backwards. It's just that we are so accustomed to moving forward into a greater state of entropy than we were before that we take that to be the norm, and that we call forward. But that is a fiction, because I know it's a fiction, because when I was a teenager experiencing God consciousness on and off every other day for 4 months, I came to know that time is now. There's no past, there's no future, it's all now. Not that now is limited to just this moment, but that now is all encompassing of all future and all past. And that means all possible futures. Everything. It's all now. It's just space that causes us, the change that happens in space that forces us to look at time in terms of phases. So it's the distinct example I used when I was a teenager was the difference between cinematic film. The images on cinematic film, 30 per second, but they're images. They're still images that moved past your vision 30 times a second, so you think it becomes a blur. You think it's all constant movement, when in reality it's not. It's phases, still images, and we think it's motion, as opposed to videotape, in which it's quicker motion. All the little molecules of iron dipole magnetics on the tape, on the VHS tape, running past the reader head on the VHS recorder or player, VHS player recorder or whatever, tape player. But time is transcendental to the state of change. So time supersedes space. It's a superset. Well, space is the subset, because space is dependent on time for its existence, but time is not dependent on space for its existence. Time can exist apart from space as now, as the eternal now. But space has only one functionality, and that's change. And that creates the illusion of past, present, and future, but it's an illusion born of space, being bounded to space, and not rising above in your perception of space, in your perception of yourself, experiencing all of these changes. You've never experienced the timelessness that is all-consuming of time. It is not just living for the moment, it's all time in a perspective of nowness. It's that kind of perspective that tells me that there's, or makes me want to question, well, how many vectors to time are there when we're considering electricity? Well, there's still two. And they are bidirectional, and they're rooted either in the absolute, charmed to go in the direction of the relative, or else they're rooted in the relative, charmed to go in the direction of the absolute. And notice I'm not talking about spatial dimensions at all. Even the same thing with electromotive force, and the same thing with a magnetomotive force. There's no spatial dimensions, which concurs with Eric Dollard when he says there's no 3 dimensions to space, there's just space. I still have a hard time with that, but at least I'm not disagreeing with him. I still don't understand it, but I'm not disagreeing with him, because everything I've been looking at so far, based on what he said as a theory for my observation within the world of the simulator, holds true. I haven't seen anything yet that does not hold true. There's nothing wrong with the simulator. It's not numerical oscillations creating a surge. It's just too loose. Mother Nature is a little more strict, because if she wasn't, she'd blow up. So I'm in agreement with Peter Lindemann and somebody else who, I think it was Paul Babcock, that we have to have these governors in place, or else Mother Nature would blow up. So I already kind of knew that, but when I heard that Paul Babcock was saying that and quoting Peter, I thought, well, that's good, because then I knew I was in the right company, and I kind of stumbled into parametric excitation on my own when I began to observe what I was seeing in the simulator and stopped denying what I was observing, because I just thought it was an anomaly of the simulator. And then I realized, no, it's not an anomaly. You change a parameter of a component in a circuit while it's running, and you can get energy disappear, or you can get it appear, and it's seen. Where does it go to when it disappears, and where does it come from when it appears? So I had to go look for something to back up my shift in opinion, and I found it in Eric. He had already talked about it years ago. I thought, wow. So I had to learn my own way. And that's the only way we can, because these are fundamental things. You can't just repeat what the teacher said and go, oh yeah, right, whatever. You don't not until a light goes off in your head based on your own experience of that quickening or awakening. Only then do you own it. Only then do you own the knowledge. And that's beyond memory, beyond memorization. And are we going to be tested on this? Do I have to study this for the test? No, you own it, and you'll never lose it. It may become dim, like all the memory I'm pulling out of my soul from God knows how long ago I studied this stuff. It wasn't recent in any memory that I know about myself, but it's there. And getting on the simulator validates to me I already know this stuff. That's why I don't have to prove anything to myself. Although I'd like to build something, And I'd like to be 100% sure that I know what I'm doing before I even build anything. I don't want to make any mistakes. I want to be like Tesla, even though I'm not Tesla. I want to make sure that when I go to build it, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly what will happen, and there's absolutely no doubt in my mind. I have no question about what I'm about to do, that it might explode or just sit there and do nothing. I want absolute certainty. And, you know, I've had my doubts, you know, whether or not I keep them to myself. I had my doubts, but the latest change I made to my book, I'm upping the price because I realize now it really is worth something. I don't have to charge the minimum that Amazon tells me. I can't take it any lower. When I have so many pages to the book, then they calculate what the price will be, the minimum, and then a maximum, and then you have that window, maximum and minimum, to choose between. Well, I don't have to choose the minimum anymore. I can raise it a little bit because I know now that I solved a problem that I was wondering about. Well, is it possible to do a certain thing with my circuit to make things easier on the part of somebody who wants to build it, like maybe me, to be less costly, so as not to have to do everything from scratch? And I solved the problem. I simulated it to my satisfaction, and it just blew me away. So I raised the price, both on the Kindle and the paperback version. Not a lot, but enough to signify that I think I believe in me now. I believe in what I'm doing when I put my neck on the line and write about it, and charge people money for it. I believe in it now. I believe it has a lot of potential for being true. A lot of potential. So, when we just follow the normal pattern of our life, which is to move forward, we take it for granted that entropy is the norm of the direction that we take, and we call it forward time, but it's no mystery to time. It's just increasing entropy. That's all it is. It's moving towards the relative from the absolute. It's a one-way vector. And this is why it's so easy to be a materialist. Okay, so now I can say something in support of materialists, and that is, you know, people who are really rooted in materialism, and that's all there is. And we can't include God into the equation of science because God doesn't belong there. We couldn't do a double-blind experiment to see if God exists. Well, now I can include the materialist and say something nice. So I'm going to say it. It's a vector. The atomic nature of the energy, at least in the energy in electricity that I study, is vectorial. That is atomic. That is non-divisible. And when we look at just one of those forces, it's the norm. It is entropy. And it moves us forward towards death, or at the very least towards a tired, fatigued body and mind at the end of the day. It takes us in that direction, and that's the norm. So we call it forward time only because that's the norm. And we take it for granted that we call it forward time, when in reality, if we think about it and try not to exclude anything that what we already know to be true in terms of common sense, then we see that, oh, it's really entropy, and it's not forward at all. There's no forward and there's no backward. You see, part of the problem is our body has 3 dimensions to it, and so we look at space and we think it's made up of three dimensions. And so whoever made up the Cartesian coordinate system, was it Descartes or was it somebody else? I'm just thinking Descartes because, it sounds like Descartes. Sounds the same, right? Cartesian, Descartes. But it may be somebody else. Whoever made it up was simply projecting his theory based on the viewpoint of his body. We have a top, our head, and we have a bottom, the sole of our feet. We have a left hand and we have a right hand. We have our belly button and we have our tailbone behind us. And when we walk forward. We could walk backwards. It's easier to skate backwards than it is to walk backwards. But we could walk backwards if we want to. We can walk sideways. We can climb up, scale a cliff, a rock face, go upwards, We can fall down and go poop. Fall down the rock face. So we have up and down and left and right and forward and backward. And even the Native American makes a prayer out of those 3 dimensions of space. You know, the 6 vectorial directions to those 3 dimensions of space. But it's all a projection based on our human nervous system, giving us that outlook. It has nothing to do with what space actually is. So this is the mistake we make about space and dimensionality, and also time. That to every forward there's a backward, and all you have to do is get in a time machine. No, all you have to do is meditate and transcend. Or all you have to do is just be lucky enough to transcend. And there are people, you know, poets spoke of it, you know, and oh, I want it back again. It was so great. How come I don't get to do it again? Because he just did it by accident, happy accident. And it made his life a little better, but it's fleeting because it's transitory. Because that's the nature of transcendental consciousness, also known as samadhi, is that it's short-lived. It's got a terminus to it. It won't stay there forever. It's going to draw you right back out. Nature is going to draw you right back out again to spread that bliss around. Fertilize her, like manure, fertilize her creation with the benefit that you got. Now she wants, and it does, and then you lose it. It dissipates. And that's entropic because it distributes. So the nature of entropy is distribution, and it's a functionality of creation to distribute her forces. This goes over there, that comes over here, and everything moves around and creates change. And so that's what we're constantly doing in nature, is we're moving around, changing, we're distributing, right? When you walk forward, you're distributing, or backwards. When things move forward in time, they're being distributed. We call it diffusion, but whatever. Time is a function of distribution because it's moving things around. And so we take that for granted. But when you transcend, when you go in the opposite direction on the wheel of rebirth, the wheel of necessity, when you take the opposite direction, distribution comes to a standstill. Nothing moves anymore. It stays put. It may only be an instant, and then in that calmness, you get to experience yourself the way you've never experienced yourself before. When I went for my first day to get initiated, to meditate for the first time as a teenager, I was lucky as a teenager to get started. I was blown away. I was speechless. I couldn't put it into words. And when my stepfather asked me, okay, well, how did it go? Because he's the one who signed his John Hancock, so to speak, on the parental consent form, because I was a minor, to abide by the laws of California, I had to get parental consent. And my mother wasn't going to give it, but my stepfather, he didn't care. I had to earn the money to pay for my technique, but I had to get permission from a parent, and he obliged me. He signed. So he asked, how'd it go? Because he's the one who stuck his neck out, right? Although it didn't seem like to him he was straining, but he was curious. And he wasn't straining, really, or else he probably wouldn't have said yes. He doesn't like to strain. My mother, on the other hand, takes the opposite approach. She strains at everything. So I have a little bit of both of them in me, since I was raised by my stepfather and not by my father. Anywho, so I asked, how did it go? And all I could say was, it's something very special, because I couldn't put it into words. I didn't know what to say. I was blown away. Anyway, so it's only by reversing ourselves on the wheel of rebirth that we are able to transcend, and then we experience a direction to our life that we didn't even think possible. We can't even imagine what are the words to describe it, because it's so unfamiliar. It's so much in contrast to what is normal. And believe me, when you're a child, you go by what's normal. You go by what's consensus. You don't want to stick out and be abnormal and weird. You want to fit in, big time, as a teenager. And so to go and meditate as a teenager and do something that wasn't weird, but it's unprecedented. If the closest word I could come up with at the time was that there's no precedence for this kind of experience in human experience, and so I'm speechless. I'm without words, because it's unprecedented to be able to experience something like this, because you're reversing yourself in time. If we talk about time in terms of forwards and backwards, but because energy is broken down into vectorial forces, there really are, there's no problem to it because they're separate and distinct from each other. It's just entropic or it's negentropic. We are living or we're transcending. So it's not like, it's either the three states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, and sleeping, or it's transcending. It's not that they are opposite to each other. It's just they're on their own path. When you're on a path of entropy, you're on a path. and so when physicists look at the world, they're totally oblivious to any other possibility because they don't have to be aware of any other possibility. So the point is, there's nothing wrong with being a materialist and calling me names. Oh, I'm nonsensical, I'm a scammer, depending on whether or not I'm charging. But regardless, people want to shoo away from me very fast and call me names and poke fun or whatever, and it hurts at first, and then I get over and I go, oh, ha ha ha, yeah, that is kind of funny. But it's ridiculous to be shut out of forums, just because I want to bring up the topic, But be that as it may, they're totally within their right mind, and they're totally within their rights, because force is atomic. It does not have to take into consideration any other force but itself, and yet it is so tunnel vision narrow-minded that it is complete denial of every other possibility. And that's exactly what Eric Dollard has been saying, that each is the complete denial of the other. He wasn't talking about time. He was talking about magnetism versus the dielectric, the other two ingredients of electrical theory, electrodynamic theory. There's time, there's the dielectric, and there's magnetism. Well, I see it as force, and all three are forces, and all three come in pairs of bidirectional forces, but only bidirectional in terms of concept, not in terms of their actuality. So we say, moving forward in time is entropic and its opposite is negentropy, but that's because we have the ability to look at both and integrate both into our awareness. And that's the beauty of the human nervous system, is that we don't have to be materialists and we don't have to be spiritual. We can be both. And a fully integrated human being is both, because we see both, we know both to be true, and it's our experience 100% all the time, spontaneous, without any effort or willful motivation on our part. It becomes an all-time reality of full integration of experience. But only by alternating between the opposite types of forces of any one pair of forces do we slowly, gradually integrate their two opposites into the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of three parts. The Sushumna goes up the middle, but the Ida and the Pingala are the right and left channels, the positive and the negative, and they see things in a very obtuse manner. But the Sushumna is their integration, and it's only when the two are in balance that the Kundalini goes up the Sushumna and opens up the chakras and raises consciousness. So you see, the nervous system is geared for integration of opposites, but the world is filled with opposites and gives us a nervous system capable of their integration in our awareness, in our functionality, in our life, in our perception, in our consciousness. So forward time and backward time are not opposite directions along a timeline. They are simply in contrast to each other, and we, for sake of convenience, take the two pairs of vectors, put their center point, or the starting point of each, on the same point, and then have them move in opposite directions so we can put it on a graph paper to make it look nice and pretty and neat. But that's not the way it is. They are oblivious to each other, complete denial of each other. And because this is the nature of force, why shouldn't the materialist be in complete denial of God? Why not? He's totally in his right, or she, totally in their rights to be in denial, because that's the nature of that force. When you're in a force, you don't see anything else. When you're wrapped up in that force, all you see is the force. And if it takes you in the direction of entropy, then that's your reality. And there is no other reality. So there's no argument. End of story. End of argument. But as an engineer, as a designer of a circuit, if you want to know the theory, at some point you've got to start integrating opposites and understand their manipulation in a circuit when you put a circuit together so that the energy starts doing things that it never did before. You start doing magical things. And, today's magic is tomorrow's science. We used to call it magic. Actually, in today's world, we don't call it magic anymore. We call it science fiction. Or we just call it fiction. Or we call it nonsense. Or we call it scamming. But what we call scamming today is fact in science tomorrow. It's just, we haven't gotten there yet, in our awareness. But some of us get there a little sooner. Have already gotten there and just have to be reminded, So now I'm reminding myself. But that's why it's okay to be a materialist. And I really have no longer I'm not going to have a good reason. I never did, but now I'm going to have to hold myself to this fact of life, that there is no good reason to talk ill of somebody who sees things in a narrow point of view, because that's the nature of force. And there's this expression. I should end now with a quote from Charlie. He made a big impression on my life because I went to see him for advanced lectures on transcendental meditation because I was a teenager, and I thought, this is weird. I'm not depressed anymore. There's got to be something wrong here with me. I'm not depressed anymore. It's good, but it's not normal. I'm usually depressed. And it didn't take long for depression to start to lift. And gradually I became happy and said, why am I happy? I'm happy for no good reason. I'm happy for no reason. It wasn't a question of no good reason. I just was happy for no reason. Well, I transcended. So I got rid of some stress, got rid of my clouded vision, and I saw things the way they are. Beautiful. The sunrise, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful day. I'm walking to a boring school, but it's all beautiful. Talk about getting high, a natural high. So I went to those lectures to try to authenticate to myself that I wasn't weird. Teenagers, they don't want to be weird. So I looked around at the 200 or 300 people, and David Lynch was one of those people at that time. He wasn't famous. He was one of the people there, and a student still at USC Film School. So, but I didn't know one person from another. I know now, because people tell me, oh yeah, he was? Oh really? I didn't know one person from another. I didn't fraternize with anyone. I just kept to myself. But I looked at everyone and judged them, and you know what? They were all normal. And you know what? If they can do this, I can stick with this. And I did. For 1 year, I kept going to every Friday night to try to authenticate to myself that I was not weird, because I wasn't depressed anymore as much as I used to be, and I kept getting less depressed, and this is weird, So I needed some authentication that I wasn't weird, just because I was healing from my depression, which really was the weirdness. It was being depressed. But I forgot how normal I was when I was a really young little kid. I wasn't depressed, at least not that much. I didn't have that much reason to be that depressed. But it was contrast. That's the point I'm making. It's contrast. It was so contrasting to what I thought was normal, which really wasn't. I just forgot what was normal, that I thought I was weird, and then I found out, looking at people, no, it's okay to not be depressed. And so I'll just keep meditating. I'll keep this up. Well, it's only by contrast that we understand things. And so as a matter of convenience, and because entropy is kind of similar to negentropy, except they're completely opposite, we put them on the same line of dimension and call it a dimension, and then put them, pointing in opposite directions, and share the same origin of a standing point, as if the negation of one is the force for the other. Now, I have no justification for assuming that to be true, because I know they are in denial of each other. In other words, you can only do one or the other. You cannot do both. See, how can you have the reversal of one be the motivation for the other? Well, in my earlier attempt to try to theorize these forces, that was the way I explained it. I said that the reaction of one force is the action of the other force. It's just that the forces themselves are not integrated with their opposite. And so they are in complete denial in that they take absolutely no responsibility for their actions, and they just dump their action out into creation, and creation says, okay, so the reaction to your action will be this other force. And so that's the way I wanted to explain it. Well, what's the nature of karma? Karma means action and reaction, not just action alone and not just reaction alone. Well, if you have pairs of opposite forces that are vectorial and they're in complete denial of each other, and Mother Nature has to integrate all this, then she says, okay, your reaction will be the other force's action, and your action will be the first force's action. And so each of you will play a role of dancing, like two dance partners, but at the same time be in complete denial of your partner. That was the best way I could deal with it at the time, and it may still be true. It may be the only way to look at it. But because they are in complete denial, it's still our choice that we put it and make a bidirectional line of endless, no endpoint that goes off in two opposite directions to infinity, but in opposite directions. It's our willful desire to take two similar forces that are completely opposite in nature and actually have them somewhat associating to create a line out of it, a synergy between them, a line, when in reality, from their perspective, they're in complete denial of each other. So this is why it's so easy to get into an argument with somebody who has a completely opposite view to you, is we've already made the mistake of creating that endless line that goes off in opposite directions, when in reality, it's two vectors that we conveniently construct into a line of infinite length. That's our choice. And it's a human construct of human mind, and that's not the way it is in reality. Because in order for them to be in complete denial of each other, then there's no such thing as a line. We draw it and we define it in geometry as opposed to a vector, a line that goes in opposite directions to infinity, but that's that's a human construct. It's a man-made construct, and it has no business in any accurate assessment of reality. So it's no wonder we argue, because we think, well, I'm entitled to argue with you because you have an opposite viewpoint to me, and that makes you related to me, and that gives me the right to engage in argumentative discussion with you. No, it doesn't. No, there's no liability, there's no responsibility to argue at all. There's no responsible need to argue at all, because each is right in its own view. Each is in complete denial of the opposite view, and each one is separate from the other and totally right in its own view. So what greater way to define peace and the lack of war and the acceptance of our differences than the study of electrodynamic theory according to the observation coming from a robotic simulator who cannot make mistakes. The only error is relative. It's not absolute. No simulator makes absolute errors unless it was designed by its creator out of a sense of responsibility to public policy, which is a synonym for corporate policy. That's the only. But if you strictly design it according to electrodynamic theory and leave out the policy changes that you work into the code, then as a robot functioning robotically, mindlessly, it can only give you the right answer, the right view of reality. The only spin to it is it might make things too easy than they really are. But otherwise, thematically, it cannot lie. It only lies in the details of minor details of inaccuracies. Well, okay, it can't be that easy to create free energy. But it's not a lie. A robot can't lie. It's just math equations. All a simulator is a GUI, a graphical user interface, to make it convenient to work with the mathematical equations that are behind them. That's all a simulator is a bunch of math. And I hate math, and so this way I get around the problem of I don't want to deal with the math, I just want to deal with designing circuits. And so this way I get to bypass the math. But I look at Paul Falstad's code in Java when I wanted to make it more realistic, because he was missing a feature that LT-Spice has, in which LT-Spice has equivalent series resistance in its caps and coils, and has other things too. But I just wanted to put in equivalent series resistance, in particular for coils, but also I wanted to be balanced, equanimous, and give it to capacitors as well. And that's when I really learned something interesting. When you give equivalent series resistance to a capacitor, you're giving it an extra energy boost. It's like negative electricity. You're giving it a boost. When you give it to a coil, it's positive resistance. When you give it to a capacitor, it's negative resistance. But be that as it may, they're reciprocals of each other. In other words, when you give equivalent series resistance to caps and coils, and that's why Eric Dahle can say all you need are caps and coils to synthesize electricity. Well, he's right, because mathematically it's right there. When you look at the coding, the Java coding in Paul Falstad's simulator, because it's open source, and you look at it, and you look at the math, he's using differential equations, but, I don't know differential equations that well, but I know algebra. And when I see the algebra inside the differential equation, and I look at the caps, and I look at the coils, and the equations between them, because I want to see where do I put the equivalent series resistance, and what I'm looking at are equations that are total reciprocal opposites of each other. Once you put resistance in there, then you see them for what they are. A coil is positive resistance, a capacitor is negative resistance. We don't think of a capacitor as negative resistance, we just think it's a wall, and the DC current can't go past the wall. But it reacts, and it reacts on both sides. And it's that reaction of the dielectric material in a capacitor that carries forth an influence to the opposite side, even though it came from one side, and it reacts on both sides. But looking at the equations taught me that something interesting, that it's all about the math. How important it is to look at simulators in terms of mathematics. And so you can't do anything wrong, because I saw what Paul Falstad did in his code. There was only one policy he put in his code, and he admitted to it. It was in his transistors and his diodes. And he put a comment. He said, and I could see it had no business being there, but at least he had the niceness to comment and say, this is here because this limit, this current limit, he said an arbitrary limit of current on his transistors and diodes because they sometimes act weird. He called it weird. Well, it's just over unity. It's a surge. It's a transient amplification, a transient amplification. We normally say a parasitic transient, but I would prefer to say that, well, you don't have to look at it as a parasite. We don't have to look at it as a brief surge. Be that as it may, it is parametric excitation. Let's leave it at that. And so it may be weird just to Paul Falstad, but it wasn't weird to me because I was making my bread and butter, so to speak, spending night and day doing nothing but surges and focusing on just that experience in a crafted circuit. Can I create a surge, and how many different ways can I create it, and can I manage it, and can I get something useful out of it, and how can I apply it, and how can I regulate it so it doesn't blow up in my face and fry the circuit if this were to be built, if it were buildable. Well, none of them were, because Paul Falstad's simulator is not realistic. So I was looking at the code to try to make it more realistic, and eventually I had to give up dealing with that simulator most of the time because it's boring. It's too easy. But that doesn't mean it's worthless. It's just too easy because there's not enough governors. There's not, apparently, I would have to take a guess estimate that not all the theory is in there. Equivalent series resistance was missing. Okay, so that's one example of electrodynamic theory that it was missing. But there was no wrong theory. It was just missing theory. Because electrodynamic theory has a lot of parts to it. And if you don't include all the parts, then the simulator is not realistic. but it still does not lie. It's just not accurate. But that doesn't mean it lies. It's just not accurate. But it's like a robot. It has to give you precisely what electrodynamic theory is. It has to, at least to the extent that it was programmed into it. So the more you put in, the more realistic it is, and then the harder it is to create over unity. But it's not impossible. It's just harder when it becomes more a realistic simulator. That covers just about everything. I think so. In this part 2 of this discussion. Yeah, I think so. So, I still don't know how to conceive, what does this new atomic model look like conceptually, but at least I can appreciate that there are 6 vectorial forces, and each one is the denial of the other, of its opposite composition. So there's no point to thinking that they're associated with each other, at least as far as they're concerned. Hey, I'm out of here. I'm me, and all is me, and that's all I have to worry about. Is each force, looks at reality that way, and so that's the reality for that force. Oh, that's what I wanted to end with Charlie. I never got to the quote. If karma must come, then let it come. But woe to he through whom it must come. In other words, if you have to be murdered, if that's your karma in life, is to eventually be assassinated, murdered, killed off, maybe accidentally killed in a car accident, then so be it. Nothing you do will disallow your karma from reaching you unless you transcend your karma. But if you don't, then it's got to reach you. Unless you raise your vibratory rate so your karma can't find you, it will find you. Granted, it will always find you. But woe to he through whom that karma is going to be delivered. So when your karma comes, Charlie would say, don't blame the postman for bringing you your mail. That's all he's doing, is bringing you your mail. Don't blame your parents for your lousy childhood. They're just bringing you your mail. I don't even get to complain. I don't get to whine. Whine. Like your out-of-tune violin playing your out-of-tune violin. Anyway. In that statement, what he's saying is, the person who brings your karma is simply acting as a force of nature at that point. Oh yeah, they're going to have karma of their own, but they do it with a certain, well, they may or may not do it with a certain innocence, but they are acting as if they're a force of nature at that point. They're not human. Because no human would do that. It wouldn't deliver you bad karma, wouldn't deliver you any karma. They wouldn't get involved. They would not want to get involved and create karma for themselves to one degree or another. So at that point, they're just a force of nature. So you see this is what I'm getting at. A force of nature, you can literally take it on as if you're a method actor taking on the character in the movie script, and you become that character so completely, you're not even yourself anymore. And some actors, it's been said of them, they don't have a life of their own until they're an actor and put on the role of the character they're going to portray. Well, that's exactly what happens with karma, because karma is a part of the forces of nature. It has to be. That's how karma moves around. It's the forces of nature in their interplay with each other. And it just so happens there are 3 gunas and 3 doshas. And the 3 doshas are the result of the 3 gunas. And the 3 doshas are what we sense, what we can measure, what we can see. We can't see the cause. We can't see the gunas. We just know they're there in theory. We infer their existence. Start, maintain, and stop, the sattva, rajas, and tamas gunas, but we can't see them. Yet the doshas, vata, pitta, kapha, mind, fiery movement, and the kapha, inertia, the heavy mass of inertia, those are the doshas. Those are just results. They're the effects of the 3 causes. So we already have, in the Vedas, 6 forces in pairs, but not exactly. They define it a little differently. If you take the triangle of the gunas, you arrange it as a triangle, then the doshas are in between. So you end up with like a hexagonal arrangement in which a dosha has its opposite, that's true, but it's not created by its opposite. It's only opposite by type. So see, that's why arguments, another reason for arguments being a waste of time. The opposite is not the cause. The opposite is simply the opposite thematically by type. So, in other words, if you put sattva at the top of your apex of your triangle, your conceptual model of the gunas, and then you put rajas to the lower left and tamas to the lower right, destruction, tamas, then the opposite of sattva is in between rajas and tamas, and is the net result of the blend of rajas and tamas. It is not the result of sattva. Even though it's opposite sattva on this circular arrangement that is thematic in terms of what's oppositional. You arrange things in order to understand them thematically, but it doesn't mean the opposite is the cause. It just is the opposite thematically speaking. The cause is actually your two neighbors. And interestingly enough, that's exactly the way the physiology operates, according to what Dr. Robert Otto Becker, MD, discovered and wrote about in his book, Body Electric. Sorry for me carrying on this video a little further. There's so many fascinating things that are interconnected here. He said when a stem cell takes up position within the body and becomes a functional cell, like a skin cell or a stomach cell, it looks to its neighbors for their voltages, and then it picks a voltage that's in between its immediate neighbors, and it decides, okay, I'm going to be that voltage in between, and then it uses that voltage reading to peer into the genetic code and decide, okay, what part of the genetic code pertains to my functionality. When I set up shop and hang a shingle, I become a toenail or I become a nose cell. It's based on my voltage. So the whole body is a topographic voltage gradient map of various voltages. And when a stem cell gets confused as a pre-10-year-old, because pre-10-year-olds have so many stem cells in their body, if it gets confused by living in a strong AC field, like living underneath high power tension wires, then little children under the age of 10 have a high proclivity for coming down with leukemia, because the stem cells are in the blood, and the blood becomes cancerous because they're confused. They don't know what their voltage is supposed to become, so they become cancerous rather than become a cell, a solid cell that can be stationed somewhere and function as a nose cell or a bone cell. So this same functionality is the same thing with, oh dear, now I can't remember where starting point before I went on this tangent. Okay, well maybe this is a good place to stop. See how fascinating this is? But that's the way I look at learning, is a process of integration. What do I already know? What did I already learn in that other subject matter that I can relate to this new subject matter? And that helps me understand the new subject matter, and I know it does, or else I wouldn't go to the trouble of integrating, and it takes extra time, so that makes me dyslexic by choice, because I take extra time. I'm not just trying to remember things, I'm trying to connect things, and that will serve as my memory. And that's why my speech is so tangential, because I've got so many things already integrated. It's like neural connections. I've got connections going to all kinds of places that you wouldn't think have any business being connected. But they are. In my head they are, because I took the trouble to find how they are related to each other. In what manner of speaking are they related? It's not, automatically clear. You make a study of the multiple subjects to see how they're all related. Because I want the big picture. I want to see how things are, related to each other. That's what I'm more interested in, is their relationships with each other. So I don't stay with any one topic forever. I usually get bored and move on to something else. I haven't gotten bored yet with electrodynamic theory, because I can see it's such a fundamental study of how the forces of nature operate at the most fundamental level of relativity. It's fascinating. It's extremely fascinating. Oh, I think the offshoot came out of a person living as a force of nature, and he delivers your karma, and he doesn't even know what he's doing. He'll have karma later when he wakes up to what he did, and I wonder why the shit is happening to him or her. Yeah, because forces are in complete denial of their opposite. So as much as we don't like things turning out the way they do, they turn out the way they do because there's no breadth of vision. People are very narrow and bounded to the way what they're doing, and they're focused. Because that's about, when money gets tight, then you have to focus, and you have to just focus on your specialization, and you just do that one thing, and nothing else exists. And because I've had absolutely no concern whatsoever about my physical existence, I'm called all kinds of names, because you must be something wrong with me, because I don't care. It's because I was born with a bronze spoon in my mouth, so I don't have to care. It's not a silver, it's not a gold, but along with that bronze spoon is the fact that I don't care. What I care about is what I get to amuse myself with while I'm here. Like, I want to understand things. I want to understand how they're related to each other. So I spend all my time studying stuff. It's, a bubble existence. It's true. It creates a certain naivety and a shock when I wake up. I find out how things really are outside. But at least I get to understand things fundamentally in ways that I couldn't have otherwise because I took the time. That's all it is. It doesn't mean I'm smarter. It just means I did the extra work, the homework. I took the extra time. That's all it amounts to, really. The way I look at it. Okay, now I can shut up, as you've been looking at my chest. Oops, sorry. You don't want to look at me, just as well.